Cleopatra's true bloodline was settled by DNA. That was the story. A worn silver coin makes that confidence feel almost reasonable. A tetradrachm struck in Alexandria during her reign. The metal darkened at the edges. Her profile still sharp enough to show the deliberate features of power. The hair gathered back, the jaw set, the gaze made for circulation. It survived because money survives. It passed from a mint to a market, from a hoard in dry ground to a collector's tray, and finally into a catalog where it became, in a strange way, a portable portrait with better odds of reaching us than any body ever had. And that is the problem. Because if you listen closely to the claims that flood feeds and thumbnails, the DNA is never attached to an artifact with chain of custody. It is attached to a desire, a need for an answer clean enough to end an argument. This film is not about harming anyone living today, and it is not about turning Cleopatra into a proxy in modern identity wars. There are no direct descendants we can responsibly point to, no family that deserves to be chased for a conclusion that the evidence may not even allow. This is about the record itself, and about what happens when the record is forced to pretend it is complete. Hold one name in mind as we go. Tryphonina. Remember exactly. We will come back to it when the paper trail narrows and the internet certainty starts to look like performance. In the reading most people inherit, Cleopatra is easy to place. She is Cleopatra VII, last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Dynasty, born into a Macedonian Greek royal house that took Egypt after Alexander's conquest and held it for nearly 3 centuries. Her father is named in the histories as Ptolemy XII. Her lovers are the most famous men in Rome. Her defeat becomes a hinge in world history, the moment the Roman Republic's afterlife hardens into empire. The official story, stated fairly, goes like this. The Ptolemies were Greek. They married within their own family to preserve legitimacy. Cleopatra, therefore, was Greek by blood, Egyptian by throne, and whatever else people argue about is modern politics projected backward. That story has real support. It fits what we know about the dynasty's origins. It matches the pattern of royal endogamy. It aligns with the fact that Cleopatra used Greek in administration and moved with ease inside a Hellenistic court culture that still saw itself as distinct. Then the first crack appears and it is quiet. It is not a scandal. It is a missing line in a family register that never existed in the tidy way people imagine it did. Cleopatra's mother is not secured by the same kind of evidence that anchors her father. Many reconstructions identify her as Cleopatra V Tryphonina, a queen associated with Ptolemy XII. But the ancient sources are thin, and the naming conventions of court recycle the same titles and the same handful of names until certainty begins to blur into habit. This does not mean Cleopatra's mother was unknown in her own time. It means the surviving record does not behave like a modern archive built to satisfy our questions. Courts record what courts need. Empires preserve what empires value. And women, especially women without independent reigns, often appear in the gaps only when a crisis forces them into ink. So the official story stands, but it stands on an assumption that is rarely spoken aloud, that the maternal line is as clean as the paternal line. It is a legitimate story. It is also a fragile one. The first person I want you to meet was not looking for Cleopatra. Dwayne W. Roller, a historian of the ancient Mediterranean, set out to do something more ordinary and, in its own way, more difficult. To write a sober political biography of Cleopatra anchored in sources, not romance. In that work, the glamour falls away and what remains is administration, propaganda, currency, alliances, grain, and the problem of reconstructing a life from texts written mostly by enemies or by those downstream of enemies. That is where the archive begins to speak in its real voice. Track 1 is documentary. It is not a single smoking document. It is a mosaic. Royal titulature, genealogical reconstructions, the habits of Ptolemaic marriage, and the Roman authors who shaped Cleopatra into a moral lesson for a new empire. Plutarch, writing centuries later, gives a detail that matters because it is so specific. He says Cleopatra could speak to many peoples without an interpreter, and that she knew the Egyptian language in a way some earlier Ptolemies did not. That is cultural evidence, not genetic evidence. But it tells you the court was not sealed off from the land it ruled. It also tells you how easily Greek and Egyptian collapse into costume if you treat identity as a single axis. Then the genealogical pattern tightens. The Ptolemies repeatedly married siblings and close kin. Genealogists have a term for what this does over time: pedigree collapse. The family tree stops branching like a wild oak and starts folding back into itself until the same ancestors appear again and again in the same positions. In such a system, a single uncertain maternal identity does not stay small. It echoes. Here is the steel man, stated plainly. You could argue that because the dynasty was so endogamous, Cleopatra's ancestry is functionally Greek-Macedonian. Regardless of one missing document, this is a legitimate challenge. It cannot be dismissed. The research team acknowledged it directly, in the cautious way serious historians do, by separating what is probable from what is proven. Now we shift to the laboratory, where certainty has its own rules. A team led by Verena J. Schunemann, working with colleagues connected to institutions including the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena and the University of Tübingen, published ancient DNA work on mummified individuals from Abu Sir el-Melek. They were not hunting celebrity genomes. They were testing whether any authentic genetic signal could survive Egyptian embalming and time well enough to be sequenced, authenticated, and compared. That accidental aim is what makes the result usable. They were looking for method and population history. They found a way to talk about Egypt that does not rely on modern assumptions. The finding, summarized carefully, is that the sampled ancient individuals showed genetic affinities closer to Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern populations than to many modern Egyptian datasets, and that later periods saw increased sub-Saharan African ancestry in Egypt. It is a real contribution, and it is also limited. One site, a constrained time window, the unavoidable bias of who gets mummified and who is buried in a way that yields DNA. This matters for Cleopatra in a strange, indirect way, because it tells you what Egypt always was, even when propaganda pretended otherwise. A corridor, a node, a place where Greek, Levantine, Nubian, Anatolian, and Egyptian lives met through trade, war, marriage, slavery, diplomacy, and ordinary migration. But here is what the science cannot do, no matter how many thumbnails insist it can. There is no verified body of Cleopatra VII. Her tomb has not been found in a way that produces remains with an unbroken chain of custody. Without that, there is no Cleopatra genome. There is no mitochondrial line to type. There is no Y chromosome to argue over. There is only context. And there is one more widely circulated scientific-sounding claim we have to face, because it is the one people mistake for proof: the supposed remains of Arsinoe IV at Ephesus, sometimes framed as Cleopatra's sister and therefore a genetic proxy. This is a legitimate challenge. It cannot be dismissed. The research team acknowledged it directly in the form of dispute. The identification of the tomb is contested. The osteological inferences were overextended. And crucially, key remains were not available for modern DNA testing in a way that would satisfy forensic standards. So the lab gives us context, not a verdict. Halfway through this story, it is tempting to feel cheated. No genome, no sealed lab envelope, no definitive haplogroup to pin on a map and call it truth. Just probability and missing names. But this is where the two tracks meet and where the absence becomes evidence of a different kind. The documentary record tells you the Ptolemaic court was a Macedonian Greek dynasty ruling Egypt with Greek administration, while Cleopatra herself consciously performed a more integrated kingship, including language and religious iconography, to stabilize power in a state that could not be ruled by distance alone. The genetics record tells you Egypt, across centuries, was not a closed container but a crossroads whose population history cannot be reduced to a single modern category. The documentary evidence and the genetic record were pointing in the same direction, not toward a simple label, but toward a complicated reality in which Egyptian can mean citizenship, culture, language, geography, and ancestry, all drifting out of alignment depending on the century you are standing in. And now we pay off the forward lock. Trifonina. The name matters because it marks the hinge between what the internet treats as solved and what the sources actually permit. If Cleopatra's mother was Cleopatra V Trifonina, then the dynasty's endogamy makes a largely Macedonian Greek ancestry even more likely. If her mother was a different Cleopatra, or a concubine whose origin was not recorded with the same care, then the range of plausible ancestry widens. But it does not widen into fantasy. It widens into the real demographics of a Mediterranean empire. Greeks settled in Egypt, Egyptians in the bureaucracy, Levantines in ports, Nubians along the southern frontier, mercenaries, traders, hostages, and households built on coerced movement. Here is the unexpected layer, and it is happening now. Millions of people take direct-to-consumer DNA tests and receive pie charts that feel like verdicts. They then project those verdicts backward onto a woman whose body is missing and whose world did not think in those categories. The past becomes a mirror for the present, and Cleopatra becomes a tool. The human stakes are not academic. They are identity, pride, belonging, and the ache of being told your history does not count. So we hold two truths at once. Cleopatra's ancestry is bounded by dynasty and context, and the desire to make it a weapon is a modern habit. The concealment here is not a hidden test result. It is a hidden architecture. Rome did not defeat Cleopatra only with ships and legions. It defeated her with story. Octavian's regime needed Cleopatra function as a symbol. Foreign luxury, female disorder, Eastern corruption, the kind of enemy a new empire could claim to have purified. In that system, Cleopatra complexity is not merely irrelevant. It is dangerous. Complexity weakens propaganda. That is the first system. The second system is dynastic. The Ptolemies practiced endogamy as policy. Sibling marriage was not only private behavior. It was statecraft, a way to compress legitimacy into a single household and to present the rulers as a kind of divine unit. The consequence, genealogically, is the pattern we already named: pedigree collapse. When the same ancestors occupy multiple branches, lineage becomes both easier to claim and harder to disentangle, because the dynasty's internal logic matters more than outside documentation. The third system is modern, and it is the one that keeps this argument alive. 19th and 20th century racial taxonomy trained audiences to demand a single label for an ancient person, as if history were a passport office. Later, platform algorithms trained audiences to reward the most confident speaker, not the most careful one. In that incentive structure, we do not have her body is punished, while DNA proved it is rewarded. Cleopatra's case is not unique in its structure. It is unique only in the prominence of the name attached to it. The Hellenistic and Roman periods produced countless documented cases in which identity was layered. A Greek-speaking official with an Egyptian religious role, a soldier from the Aegean buried by the Nile, a family that changes names across generations to fit power. Genealogists have terms for parts of this, but the deeper pattern is simpler. States and empires turn people into categories because categories are governable. The living present anchor is unavoidable. Egyptians today inherit not only monuments, but the long history of outsiders narrating Egypt for them. Greeks today inherit the story of Hellenism as a civilizational bridge. Communities across Africa and the diaspora inherit a history of being told that Africa is not sophisticated enough to have produced its own complexity. Cleopatra becomes a stage where those inheritances fight. And now we can say the quietest truth of the whole investigation. The record was never designed to settle modern arguments about race. It was designed to survive power. Late at night, a coin is a strange thing to hold. It is warm from your fingers, heavy for its size, and indifferent to your questions. Cleopatra's face on metal does not tell you who her mother was. It does not tell you what her childhood sounded like when the palace went quiet. It does not tell you what she feared when Rome's story began to close around her like a net. What it tells you is that she understood permanence. Coins are propaganda. Yes, they are also a confession. A ruler admits, in metal, that the future may never preserve the body, the letters, the voice, or the private name, but might preserve this small official likeness passed hand to hand long after politics that minted it have turned to dust. If you came here for a DNA conclusion, the honest ending will feel almost unfair. There is no verified Cleopatra genome. There is no scientific paper that can responsibly print her haplogroup. There is no lab report with her name at the top and a barcode at the bottom that we can trace from excavation to freezer to sequencer to publication. There is only what careful work can still do. It can tell you her father's dynasty. It can tell you the political uses of her image. It can tell you that Egypt was a crossroads, and that human movement across the Mediterranean was constant enough to make any rigid category suspect. It can tell you that one uncertain maternal identification, the name Trifonina spoken like a key, matters not because it unlocks a scandal, but because it forces humility on a culture addicted to certainty. And it can defend the subject without flinching. Cleopatra's achievements are not diminished by any ancestry label a modern audience wants to paste onto her. Her statecraft was hers. Her linguistic skill was hers. Her calculated risk-taking, her failures, her ability to hold a collapsing kingdom together longer than it had any right to endure, belonged to her as a human being, not to an abstract bloodline. So we end where we began, with the artifact that survives because it was built to survive. A silver coin from Alexandria, a face made for circulation, and a question that remains when the science is finished and the propaganda is stripped away.